It began like any other hearing, quiet, procedural, almost predictable. But 5 minutes in, the courtroom started to buzz with a different kind of electricity. Judge Tanya Chutkan leaned slightly forward, pen in hand, the faint tapping on her bench echoing through the chamber. Across from her stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, sharp, steady, and already dismantling decades of constitutional complacency. What was supposed to be a sterile debate on sentencing reform had just turned into a moral trial of the entire justice system itself. What happened? Crockett had brought evidence so precise, so damning, that even the Department of Justice attorneys looked like they'd swallowed glass. Why did she do it? Because she wasn't there for applause, she was there for justice that had been delayed, distorted, and denied. Who was she calling out? A federal system that punished people like Marcus Johnson, a father of 3, for 17 years on a charge that today wouldn't even earn 5. How did she expose it? Through data, testimony, and the kind of composure that makes truth sound like thunder. And where? In Judge Chutkan's courtroom, the one place in America that, on that day, finally felt like it was listening. Crockett began calmly, but her words hit like precision-guided strikes. When Congress itself has declared a law too harsh to stand, she said, continuing to enforce it isn't justice, it's vengeance. The crowd murmured. One of the prosecutors shifted in his seat. Judge Chutkan's gaze didn't move. She was listening, truly listening, and that was the moment everything changed. But this was only the beginning. Crockett's evidence was a weapon wrapped in empathy. She introduced Marcus Johnson's story, a man who lost 17 years of his life for a mistake that white counterparts had walked away from with probation. What made it hit even harder was how she told it. Marcus missed his daughter's first steps, his son's first words, and his youngest's graduation. The law didn't punish him, it erased him. The room went silent. Even the DOJ counsel stopped flipping through his notes. The story had turned statistics into heartbreak, and heartbreak into fire. Then Crockett did something few have dared in that courtroom. She challenged the core logic of the Department of Justice's own argument. You say retroactive relief is inconvenient, she said, her voice rising just enough to cut through the air. But tell me, since when did administrative comfort outweigh constitutional decency? Judge Chutkan's eyebrow lifted. That was not a question, it was a warning, the kind that comes before a turning tide. The DOJ counsel, a man named Robert Keene, adjusted his tie and countered with bureaucratic precision. Congresswoman, justice requires order. We cannot rewrite the past for administrative preference. Crockett smiled, a slow, knowing smile that could slice through steel. Mr. Keene, she said, justice requires courage, not comfort, and the Constitution doesn't respect your paperwork. The audience stifled laughter. Even the judge's lips twitched for a split second before she composed herself again. But what happened next shocked the entire courtroom. Crockett turned her argument inward, tying every thread of law, history, and human consequence into a single constitutional lifeline. She invoked the Eighth Amendment not as a shield but as a scalpel. The phrase, evolving standards of decency, isn't decorative language, she said. It's a mirror. It reflects who we are, and right now we're staring at a reflection that should shame us. The DOJ tried to object, but Judge Chutkan waved them off. Proceed, she said, that one word cracked through the air like a gavel itself. Crockett outlined her 3-part principle: explicit congressional rejection of a sentencing standard, gross disproportionality between old and current punishment, and the absence of public safety risk. It was clean, logical, and morally unassailable. The law has moved forward, she concluded. It's time the justice system stopped dragging its feet through the past. Tension surged through the courtroom like static before a lightning strike. Then, release. The judge leaned back, silently nodding. Even she couldn't hide it anymore. Crockett wasn't just arguing law, she was reshaping it. And yet, Crockett wasn't finished. We talk about finality, she said, glancing at Keene, but when a sentence defies fairness, it isn't final, it's fossilized. She paused, letting the words echo, and fossils belong in museums, not prisons. Laughter rippled through the gallery, breaking the heaviness just enough. Even Chutkan smirked subtly but unmistakably. Keene recovered, leaning forward with a dry smile. So, Congresswoman, by your logic, every outdated law becomes a constitutional crisis. Crockett's eyes narrowed. Only the ones that imprison people for standards we've already rejected. I'm not here to rewrite history, I'm here to stop it from repeating itself. The judge's pen stopped moving. She looked directly at Crockett. The silence was thick enough to choke on. Then came the words no one expected. Counsel approached the bench. Every camera in the room turned, every whisper stopped. Crockett stepped forward, steady as a soldier. Keene followed, visibly rattled. Judge Chutkan leaned in, her voice calm but edged with something new: respect. "Miss Crockett," she said quietly, "your argument is exceptional. I want a supplemental brief on this constitutional theory. You will file it within 10 days. Keene blinked. "Your Honor, the Congresswoman isn't a party." Chutkan cut him off, tone slicing through his objection like glass. "She is now." The room erupted in stunned murmurs. Crockett bowed her head slightly, a gesture not of triumph but of acknowledgement. She had just changed the entire trajectory of the case. But this courtroom wasn't done surprising anyone. When Crockett returned to the lectern, her tone softened. "Your Honor," she said, "this case isn't just about statutes, it's about people like Marcus Johnson, people who believed the system would correct itself. It didn't, so we're here to correct it for them." Judge Chutkan's face, normally unreadable, shifted just a flicker, but it was enough. The courtroom felt it. The gravity had changed. As the hearing adjourned, the audience rose not with applause but with quiet dignity. Families clasped hands. A man in the back wiped his eyes. Even the guards looked uneasy, as though they just witnessed something they couldn't categorize. Outside, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed, but Crockett walked straight past them, her voice low and resolute. "We're not fighting for headlines," she said. "We're fighting for lives." Inside, Judge Chutkan lingered on the bench for a few extra seconds, eyes distant. She had presided over hundreds of cases, but none had left the room vibrating like this. And indeed, 63 days later, her ruling would rewrite constitutional boundaries. But at that moment, all anyone could feel was the seismic tremor of justice waking up. But the story didn't end there, it evolved. The Department of Justice tried to steady its ground. Internal memos flew, officials whispered about precedent risk and systemic exposure. They feared a domino effect, a wave of constitutional challenges that could unravel decades of old sentencing. But the problem was Crockett's argument, it was its truth. They couldn't unhear it, they couldn't unsee it. In private, Keene's tone shifted from arrogance to concern. "If Chutkan writes this into law," he told a colleague, "we'll have to rebuild entire sections of federal sentencing review." The colleague shrugged. "Maybe it's about time." Meanwhile, Crockett worked late into the night crafting her supplemental brief. Her team described it as a constitutional grenade wrapped in velvet. It was elegant, lethal, and impossible to ignore. The core thesis, that justice, once updated by legislative reform, cannot morally or constitutionally be applied through outdated cruelty. Her writing was as surgical as her speech. Every paragraph tightened the noose around institutional indifference. She didn't just cite precedent, she built new precedent out of logic and conscience. And through it all, she wove Marcus Johnson's story like a thread of humanity binding the law to its moral purpose. By the time she filed the brief, even the DOJ's senior attorneys privately admitted it was brilliant. One reportedly said, "If Chutkan buys even half of this, we're looking at a generational shift in Eighth Amendment jurisprudence." They were right. When the decision finally arrived 63 days later, it landed like thunder over a quiet city. 87 pages of judicial precision and moral reckoning. Judge Chutkan's ruling didn't just acknowledge Crockett's theory, it adopted it. She declared that enforcing explicitly rejected sentencing standards constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the evolving standards of decency. She established a three-part constitutional test, Crockett's very framework, and ordered a nationwide review of sentences exceeding current law by at least 50%. A special master would oversee it, focusing first on nonviolent drug offenders. And in that single stroke, history turned. But even then, the real shock was yet to come. The ruling dropped like a meteor into the legal world, massive, undeniable, and glowing with constitutional heat. Within hours, law schools were dissecting it. Cable networks ran emergency panels. And in every federal district, clerks began quietly digging through old case files looking for prisoners who might finally go home. Judge Chutkan's decision didn't just reinterpret law, it redrew the moral architecture of the Eighth Amendment. For the first time in decades, evolving standards of decency had a tangible definition. And at its center, carved into precedent like marble, were Jasmine Crockett's words. What had she done? She turned empathy into evidence. Why did it matter? Because law without conscience is tyranny dressed in robes. Who did it affect? Thousands, mostly forgotten men and women who'd aged behind bars for crimes long since deemed excessive. How did it happen? Through a courtroom rebellion that started with one congresswoman refusing to lower her voice. And where did it echo loudest? Across a country realizing it had punished the powerless long after justice had evolved past cruelty. But even then, Crockett didn't celebrate. Reporters waited outside her office for a triumphant speech. Instead, she said something that silenced the noise. This wasn't a victory, it was a correction, and we still have years of wrongs left to right. Inside the DOJ, things were chaos wrapped in formality. Legal analysts debated whether to appeal. Some wanted to fight, others saw the writing on the wall. One senior official reportedly said, "If we appeal, we look heartless. If we don't, we admit we were wrong." A silence followed. Then the Attorney General spoke just 2 words, "We don't appeal." And just like that, the Department of Justice, normally the fortress of inertia, surrendered to morality. It was unprecedented, but it was also the smartest political move in decades. Fighting this ruling would have been like arguing against gravity. As weeks passed, the dominoes began to fall. The Special Master Office opened in Washington, D.C., a bland building from the outside, but inside it pulsed with quiet revolutions. Case reviewers sat surrounded by boxes of old files, many stamped "Final, do not revisit." They revisited anyway. The first to walk free was Marcus Johnson. His release wasn't televised, but someone filmed it on a phone anyway. The footage showed him stepping into the sunlight, blinking as if the world had become too bright to look at. His daughters, now grown, ran to him. No music, no speeches, just raw, trembling silence before the sound of sobbing broke it open. That clip went viral in hours. Jasmine Crockett watched it alone in her office. No smile, no tears, just a long exhale, the kind of breath you take when something inside you finally unclenches. Then she whispered almost to herself, "One down, thousands to go." But the system wasn't ready for what came next. Within 6 months, more than 300 people had been released. Thousands more were awaiting review. The special master's process moved with surgical precision, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The media, once skeptical, started calling it the Crockett Doctrine. Law professors called it the Chutkan Test. Either way, it was rewriting the justice playbook. In one fiery op-ed, a conservative columnist tried to downplay it. "This decision sets a dangerous precedent," he wrote, "where emotion overrides order." Crockett responded on live television with a line that would be replayed for years. "If you think mercy is emotion, you've never understood justice." That clip exploded across social media. Even her critics couldn't deny it. She'd redefined moral authority in the courtroom. But tension wasn't gone. Inside federal agencies, resentment simmered. Prosecutors whispered about the Crockett effect, where judges started questioning old plea deals and calling out past excesses. One veteran attorney muttered, "She turned guilt into guilt trip." Another replied, "Maybe it's about time." But then came the twist no one saw coming. A month after the DOJ's acceptance, a group of former inmates filed a motion to expand the ruling's scope, to include violent crimes reclassified under modern law. It was audacious, maybe reckless, but it forced the nation into another moral mirror. Should evolving standards apply only to nonviolent crimes, or should the Constitution's decency clause evolve for everyone? The debate raged again. Crockett stayed silent this time, when pressed by journalists. She said only, "I gave the law its mirror. The rest of you decide how clearly you want to see yourselves." And in that single line, she transformed from reformer to symbol. Judge Chutkan, for her part, stayed steady. When legal historians later asked why she invited Crockett to file that brief, her answer was simple: because sometimes the Constitution needs a translator. It became one of the most quoted lines in modern legal discourse. Meanwhile, the data arrived, and it shattered every cynic's defense. Of the hundreds released, only 7% reoffended. 7. The same bureaucrats who once argued about public safety risk now had to face statistics that screamed the opposite. The DOJ's own internal study called it a model of stable reintegration. For once, government paperwork told a story of redemption instead of ruin. But the true ending wasn't in the numbers, it was in the silence that followed. Months later, in the same courtroom where it all began, Judge Chutkan presided over a routine hearing. At the end, she paused and addressed the public gallery. "Justice isn't static," she said quietly. "It grows, it learns, it redeems." Then she looked at the empty seat where Crockett had once stood and added, "And sometimes it listens." The room stood still. No one clapped. No one dared breathe, because everyone there knew they'd witnessed a turning point, not a performance. Afterward, Crockett returned to her work in Congress, continuing to push legislation that reflected the same principles she'd argued in court. Her colleagues, even those who once dismissed her, started seeking her counsel on reform bills. Her name became shorthand for integrity sharpened by intellect. Reporters still tried to get sound bites from her. She always gave the same line, "Justice doesn't need a microphone, it needs momentum." And she gave it that. Over the next year, her framework influenced 5 new appellate decisions and triggered a bipartisan commission on sentencing modernization. For the first time in decades, reform wasn't a campaign slogan, it was a constitutional movement. One night, long after the headlines had faded, Crockett visited Marcus Johnson's community center built by former inmates to help others re-enter society. They called it the Mirror House, named after her own metaphor. Marcus greeted her with a quiet smile. "You gave me my life back," he said. Crockett shook her head. "No, Marcus, the law just remembered it owed you one." They stood in silence for a while, watching a group of kids play basketball outside. It wasn't grand, it wasn't televised, but in that small corner of justice reborn, the Constitution had finally kept its promise. And somewhere far away in a chamber lined with marble and memory, Judge Tanya Chutkan closed another file, signed her name, and whispered the same word that had started it all: proceed. Because this wasn't just a courtroom victory, it was a constitutional resurrection, a reminder that even the coldest structures of law can learn to feel again. The world didn't change overnight, but something in its foundation had shifted forever. The Crockett Doctrine became case law, the Chutkan test became judicial training, and every law student who once studied cruel and unusual punishment now read it differently, less as theory, more as obligation. And yet, perhaps the greatest legacy wasn't the ruling or the releases or the policy reforms. It was the reawakening of belief that a single voice, clear and relentless, could still bend the arc of justice toward decency. In the end, history would write it plainly. On that day, the courtroom didn't just hear Jasmine Crockett's voice, it listened to its own conscience. Because when justice forgets who it serves, it takes someone fearless to remind it. And that's exactly what she did.